Good day. I'm John Kraft, and for those of you that don't know me, I am the Southern Indiana Realtors Association General Counsel. I've been in this position. June of 2021 will be my beginning of my 37th year in that position. Hopefully I don't look that old, but I understand that cameras can put weight on you. They can probably put wrinkles on you as well. So with that said, bear with me as I try to remember what I need to tell you today. Today we're speaking about the addendum to the purchase agreement called the Escalation Clause. This is a document that has been put together as a result of what is very much a seller's market. Many people say, well, what is an escalation clause? And what I'm here today to do is to explain to you as an agent what the escalation clause is, when it can be used, how it needs to be used, and make certain that it's being used properly. To begin with, as the name suggests, an escalation clause is a clause that can be included in a purchase agreement. Does not have to be, but if you are in a hot market, and at the time the seller's market being what it is, it allows you as a prospective purchaser or an agent representing a prospective purchaser, if there are the possibility of multiple offers coming in on the same property, the clause allows your buyer, if you are the buyer's agent, but allows your buyer to increase the suggested purchase price in order to avoid getting outbid on that particular property. The buyer's balance on that situation as such is, one, questioning will they overpay for the property or will they lose the house? And in many instances, a house being a property that is desired, and a house becomes a home when it ultimately is lived in. But if there's a possibility of losing that house that this particular purchaser dreamed of, they typically will want to look at the possibility of an escalation clause. SIRA has the Indiana Association of Realtors form that is being used currently, and that escalation clause is an addendum. And certainly when that escalation clause agreement, when that addendum comes into being, is again, if you have a purchaser that really wants a property, that wants to make certain if the property is being marketed in a fashion that there may be an expectation of a number of multiple offers, it allows the possibility of a purchaser to indicate, I will offer X dollars, let's use, for example, $100,000 as the original purchase price, but I will also agree that in the event there are multiple offers, that I will extend my bid or increase my bid, or as the clause indicate, escalate my bid in increments of a given dollar. And again, we started with a price of $100,000, and let's indicate that your increments are $2,000 if it requires that to be done. What the escalation clause allows to happen is within the addendum, as a purchaser, that purchaser would indicate that there is an amount that they will pay in the event competitive bidding comes into play. Then at that particular instance, that bid will be increased by $5,000 to overcome a bid that may be more than the $100,000. But what is required with the use of an escalation clause is there has to be a bona fide purchase agreement from another possible purchaser. In order to secure that better sales price for the seller, if you happen to be the seller's agent, it would allow to increase the price to an amount that would be used for the sale to take place. Now, the bona fide purchase agreement must be from a bona fide purchaser. Some people tend to say, well, wouldn't this allow for the possibility of fraud? If a seller really wanted to up the price, could they indicate, well, we have another offer and it is $102,000, so that requires that bid to be increased to $105,000. Keep in mind, in order for that offer to be an escalation clause offer, there has to be a bona fide purchase agreement. Within the body of the addendum, there is a requirement that the documentation for that other offer must be given when requested. So in that vein, as a possible purchaser, you understand that if you really want the property and you're willing to up your bid in an increment of $5,000, the question tends to be, how far do you go? The other piece of the escalation addendum allows not only for the amounts as to the $5,000 that we're using as an example, but it also specifically allows for you to put a cap or a maximum amount as to what you may bid if it comes into a competitive bidding situation. So basically you have three components. You have one, the original purchase price that you're offering. Then the question tends to be, how much are your increments going to be in the event that there is a competitive bidding situation in which another bona fide purchase agreement comes into play? What amount are those increments? And then third, what is the maximum amount to be paid? Now, all of that sounds quite easy. It can get complicated. Part of the reason why it can get complicated is your amount that you may be offering initially may be what buys the property if there's not a competitive bidding situation. In the alternative, if there is that competitive bidding situation, what if your cap is less than one of the offers that comes into being? And if that's the case, then you lose out on the property immediately because you capped your number at a number that is less than what was offered in another bona fide purchase agreement. When we look at the situation as such, and you look at the possibility of trying to cap it, two things come into being with that. Keep in mind first and foremost that an escalation clause only relates to price, because the escalation is merely going to up the price to bid. But keep in mind that sellers, or you as a seller's agent, are going to be looking at the other terms that come into play with that purchase agreement. For instance, if it's a cash purchase versus a FHA financing, or versus some other form of insured financing, and the possibility of a closing taking place much quicker than if it goes through financing. So those items need to be understood, that while an escalation clause is only going to relate to the price, if you're an agent that's representing a seller, it's not out of the likelihood of that seller indicating, I don't care if they're offering more, I want to look at the terms as well, and this buyer, while maybe $2,000 less, this buyer happens to be a cash buyer. So you have to look at those issues, understanding that the escalation clause solely deals with price. When we look at that from a buyer's perspective, a buyer is always going to have in mind, what do I need to do to get that property? I don't want to lose that house. If there's financing involved as well, the other piece that has to come into play tends to be, will the property appraise for the necessary value based upon the amount of the loan? So when we look at the agreement itself, the addendum, first and foremost, we look at the first paragraph on the escalation terms. The escalation factor comes into play again only if there is a bona fide purchase agreement with terms that are acceptable to the seller. That's the first element for the escalation clause to operate. The second piece of that is setting out your cap if you are the buyer. And then the third element that comes into play is asking for documentation if it comes to the point that you have lost the property based upon an escalation clause that ultimately someone else has outbid you. Likewise, if you get the house and the price is more than really what you wanted to go, but you agreed in writing to cap it at that number, you still have the capability of asking for the documentation which caused that escalation clause to be put into play. The escalation clause of the purchase agreement and the factors in many instances may result in some factors that weren't given consideration. If there is financing in place, Again, if it's a cash sale, the next portion of the addendum to the purchase agreement is inapplicable, because in the second paragraph, there are 4 options that can take place if financing is in place. If the buyer is going to finance the purchase, then in that particular instance, you have to deal with 4 elements. And there are 4 choices, and you only have one of those 4 to check if you are a buyer's agent. And that is, the first one would be that the loan amount provided for in the original purchase agreement, that you are willing, in that particular instance, under that provision, that the loan amount for the purchase agreement shall remain the same. So ultimately, what it's saying is you're going to have to come up with more cash at the time of closing. That's the first choice. The second choice under this provision is that the down payment amount provided in the purchase agreement shall remain the same, and the increase shall be added to the loan amount. So again, as you are reviewing this as an agent, whether it's for the buyer or whether it's for the seller, you have to take into consideration some appraised values when dealing with that if the loan amount is going to be increased by virtue of this change. The third element, and this again comes back to the fact that the loan amount provided for in the purchase agreement shall be automatically increased to be a certain percentage. Now there is a blank there, and certainly it's not a bad idea to calculate what the original loan amount is for the original purchase price and try to make a determination if that's going to remain the same percentage or if you're going to change that percentage. But again, this is the third choice under that provision. The fourth choice is the loan amount shall not exceed, and you're able to fill in a dollar amount. That the loan amount shall not exceed a given dollar amount, and the buyer shall pay any amount of the increase in that price by virtue of the escalation clause. And that means coming up with more cash. So those 4 elements become a key piece of it if there is financing involved. It is very wise, if you are, of course, a listing agent, that you have this discussion with a seller at the time you list the property as to what an escalation clause is, 1, when it may come into play, and 3, how to actually use that escalation clause to the seller's advantage. In many instances, what we're seeing in today's market tends to be that sellers are indicating that the property can be shown on a given time or after a given time. Offers will be taken but not actually presented to a seller until a given day and time. And what that does is puts the buyers, if there are competitive buyers, puts them in an auction situation for the most part, which means if there is an escalation clause, your escalation clause for your buyer, if you're the buyer's agent, is going to be compared with the escalation clause for the others. So the result of that tends to be, if it is a bidding situation, your buyers, if you're the buyer's agent, need to examine how badly they want the house, and likewise, are they going to be put in a position, 1, to go over budget, or 2, is the property not going to appraise if they're trying to seek financing that may require a larger percentage of the loan being towards the purchase versus a cash payment. So when that happens, we have to deal with, what do you do as an agent? First and foremost, I think it's important that you understand that you as an agent have a fiduciary duty as determined by statute, not a fiduciary duty specifically as common law would recognize, but Indiana law with respect to buyer and seller agency abrogates common law, and there are specific duties that are set out in the statutes. So first and foremost, understand who you're representing. Because in this instance, as most people look at it, the seller has the upper hand. As the seller at that point in time, if there are competitive offers, the seller knows what each of those buyers is willing to go up to. The seller is also going to know all of the other terms of those purchase agreements, and as we talked about, the escalation clause only relates to the price. So if you have a cash purchaser versus someone that is seeking 90% financing or something more than that, and the closing date may be sooner, then the seller is going to look at that probably closer. In the alternative, if the seller is building a new house and they need a delayed closing, they're probably going to look at those terms. So it's really not a matter of just saying we're going to base this solely upon the price. We're going to base it upon the price and the other terms to be considered by the seller. The buyer should be advised how that process exists. There's nothing worse than a buyer falling in love with a house that they've wanted all of their lives, and then they put an escalation clause in place to make certain they receive that property, and then at the end of the day they lose out on it because the escalation clause was not written in a fashion that allowed them to take advantage of it. The buyers as well as the sellers in a situation concerning an escalation clause are looking to you as the agent to help them and guide them, one, as to whether or not an escalation clause should be used, or two, and sellers sometimes look at this in a fashion that says, if they're willing to pay that much as to operation of the escalation clause, why didn't they make that offer to me to begin with? And sometimes, and again, people being people, sometimes sellers get upset if they recognize that you will go up to, or your buyer will go up to $130,000, but the original offer was $105,000. They may look at it and say, well, why didn't they just come forward with their best offer at the outset? And because of that, again, sellers are going to be looking at the bottom line more than anything, but because of that, in some instances, sellers may be upset to say, well, they should have given me their best offer to begin with, and since they didn't, I'm going to go to the other buyer. The main hope for the buyer is to get the house without overpaying, because at the end of the day, the overall issue is going to be, will the house appraise for the amount of the loan that the buyer is looking? The buyer is also looking for peace of mind. The buyer looking to you as a buyer's agent for perhaps some guidance on properties selling around that area, and likewise, if in fact it will appraise. No one really knows the answer to that question as far as if the property will appraise, but I think you have to be very cautious in implementing an escalation clause that takes a cap to a point that may be outside the market. The cons of that tends to be, does the listing agent understand how an escalation clause works? And certainly, I ask each of you as agents, as you're going to list a property, fully understand the addendum and explain it at the time you list a property, especially in a market that is moving quickly, and it is much of a seller's market, rather than waiting until the first purchase agreement comes in that has an escalation addendum. Because if your sellers don't have the understanding at the outset of the possibility of offers coming in with escalation clauses, and especially if there are multiple offers coming in at the same time, this should not be a surprise to them when that happens. So upon the presentation of listing the property, there should be a discussion concerning the escalation clause. The other piece of it from the standpoint of a buyer con, if you will, if you're looking at pros and cons, is the buyer giving up their position at the outset to negotiate? Because at the point in time that the addendum comes into play and the escalation clause comes into play, at that point in time, the seller is automatically going to know how high that buyer will go. Sometimes people tend to say, well, maybe the best thing to do is just reject all of these and go back with a counteroffer for what the best offer was and see if we can arrange that situation to happen. Certainly that's a seller's choice, and certainly the seller is going to look to you as the agent for guidance. The seller also is able to look at that cap and again indicate, well, if they'll go to that price, why didn't they offer that first? There's a great deal of confusion that happens with the escalation clause. The whole idea is primarily to represent your principal, whether it be a buyer, if you're a buyer's agent, whether it be the seller if you're a seller's agent, and likewise if you're a limited agent, you have to be even more cautious in that vein. But when you look at the overall process, it's relatively simple. And that is, understand your relationship with your client, buyer, seller, or otherwise, and then do what you intended to do based upon that representation. You must remember who you are an agent for. The buyers and the sellers are looking to you for guidance. The one thing that comes about, and this is kind of a key element that comes into being with the addendum, is if there is the implementation of the escalation clause, there is a competitive bidding situation. And ultimately, there is an agreement based upon one buyer's escalation clause. What then happens, and this is a key piece of how it works, because if you look at paragraph 5 under the terms of the addendum, it indicates in the event that the seller agrees to accept a purchase price within the terms of this purchase agreement and pursuant to the escalation clause. So again, understanding your original purchase agreement, it's escalated out now up to a specific dollar amount, whether it be your cap or whether it be an increment that you agreed to go to. But in that instance, if it's pursuant to the escalation clause, at that point, the seller will then submit to the buyer a counteroffer and a copy of that addendum in order to make certain that all of this is documented in writing, because under Indiana's statute of frauds, to be enforceable, there must be an agreement, it must be in writing, and it must be signed by all parties. Do not have the understanding that because the addendum, the escalation clause addendum was accepted with your buyer, that automatically it's a go. There must be a writing that confirms what has just occurred through the use of the escalation clause as an addendum to that purchase agreement. The main thing is, hopefully, we continue to be in a market like this. Hopefully, the escalation clause, if it is used properly. And as an agent, should you have questions, don't hesitate to ask your broker. They are there for one purpose, and they are there to make certain, one, that you do your job in line with the ethics of the National Association of Realtors, that you perform your duties in line with the agency law, and ultimately you represent the person to whom you chose to be an agent for. Good luck with the addendum on the purchase agreement and the escalation clause, and certainly from this day forward, don't hesitate to look at your broker for guidance. Thank you.